So this is the 150th anniversary interview with Professor Emeritus Walter Morrow. And let me start by asking you, where were you born and where did you grow up?
All right, I was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a day when it was a big factory town. Lots of armament. The Springfield Armory is there, and many other factories of different types around. That's all gone today, I'm afraid. At any rate, it was a very technical town, and I, from an early age, had technical interests. When I was maybe 8 or 10 or something like that, I had my own chemistry laboratory, for instance, in the house, a special room filled with chemicals and whatnot. And my father was in charge of large electrical construction projects in the Boston area, well, not the Boston area, Springfield area, and north of there. So he was much into the side of electrical systems, but I became interested in the, and this was a fallout from the chemistry business, in which I got sort of bored after a while. It was a fallout into electronics, which was just beginning to be a big thing. And so while I was in the schools there, and I'll talk about the schools in a minute, I'm busy building things around the house, telegraph systems, shortwave receivers, and later large antenna on the house to receive TV from a long distance because there was no TV station in Springfield. Now, the school system then in Springfield was an entirely different thing that you could find today. This was in the Depression, and there were people desperate for jobs, and so the teachers that were chosen were the very best people that you could hire. And they were at the top of their classes graduating. As you're probably aware, that situation is inverted today, and the teachers are taken from sort of the bottom of the intellectual scale. In particular, the high school that I attended, Springfield Technical High School, I think it was called, was staffed with people who couldn't get jobs in the Depression, but were very, very skilled. For instance, the chemistry teacher came from running a chemical plant. He was, you know, the real thing. The physics professor the same way, and taught multiple subjects, not only physics, but he taught electronics and aerodynamics and so forth. This was a school, a technical school that was really intensive, and there is no duplicate that I've ever seen since then. There were machine shops run by people who used to run machine shops, and all kinds of things of this sort. It was a very, very intense place. And the education there was at a level where, when I came to MIT, and I'll talk about how that came about, I essentially knew everything in the freshman class, all the different courses and whatnot, with the one exception of calculus, which was not taught in that school at that time. Now, when it came time to graduate, it was at the end of World War II, 1945. There were great turbulence, you might say, in the universities at that time because of the draft and all the rest of it. So when I began to look around for places that I'd like to go to, I was looking for technical places, and the two that interested me the most were Yale and MIT. And in both places, because of the things that I had done at the school, building experimental systems that were shown in the classrooms, not by the teacher but by myself, there was an instant exception at both places. No tests, nothing. Just all they did is talk to the teachers in the school. I got some kind of an award at the end of the time in technology. It was a unique award. Only one person got it, and I was that person. So I come to MIT at the end of the war, and the place is still in the war when I come, because it's July. The course at MIT was a all the year round course. It was a 3-term course. There was so much rush to get people through the course for the war. So it started in July. The war hadn't ended yet in July. There's still the war in the Pacific. And the radiation laboratory, which I knew about, I guess, by other people telling me about this place, was in full bore operation here at the Institute. And that included operations on a number of the current buildings, and included one building which has since been torn down to make the new building for research in artificial intelligence, I guess is what you'd say. At any rate, I came here at the age of 16 in that spring of 1945, and it was a pretty rough place. There were no tutors or nothing. It was, live or dead, die by the exams that came every 3 weeks. And that was not a big problem for me because of the high school, which had covered all of that, essentially, except for calculus before. The biggest problem came in the sophomore year. There was a transition from professors teaching the classes to assistants carrying the classes, teaching the classes. And their quality was definitely different than the professors. These were graduate students who were teaching assistants, and they handled most of the classes. So it was a struggle in these classes to get what they're trying to convey, and not conveying it terribly well.
Let me back up for 1 second. Why did you choose MIT over Yale?
Yale had a very strong chemistry courses and professors, but it had essentially nothing in the electronics area. And I knew about the radiation lab, and that was the beginning, as I mentioned to you before we came here, of MIT growing to be what it is today. The MIT's current situation is directly the result of the radiation lab being here and being staffed by professors from the Institute.
Do you want to tell that story now, since we're...
All right. Well, when World War II began, there was a serious problem about detection of submarines and detection of aircraft and so forth. And the radars that existed at that time were so-called long wavelength radars. They operated at 200 megahertz with a wavelength of a meter or so. And they were not able to do a lot of things that were very desirable. Very hard to put them in an airplane, for instance, because the antennas were too big. And the English had been working prior to that time on microwave vacuum tubes, not with a thought of particularly being used to build radars, but just as a new kind of a vacuum tube. And the British, in part for the exchange of the destroyers, the 50 destroyers that we gave the British before we got in the war, they came here with a cavity magnetron, one of them, and it was about the only one in the world that existed. And that appeared in the scene, I think, roughly 40 1940, maybe 1941, but it was right in that period. And the decision was made by people in Washington, and ones from MIT had a large impact on this, that the development of that device into microwave radars for all of the military forces would take place here at MIT with an organization that was separate from the institute, but was using their professors, their facilities, and their buildings, and extra buildings were built for this enterprise. The speed with which that single device was transmitted into capabilities for naval fleets and aircraft was incredible. Inside of 2 years, they had 1,000 ships equipped with these radars. There's nothing like that can be done today, but they did do it. And a variety of other kinds of radars that were also developed were carried through and deployed in the field. This effort was not solely carried out here. There were companies that were, well, you might say, recruited to build the equipment. So nothing was built here except prototypes. Raytheon was one of them, and the other was Western Electric. And those two companies were told, you will build them night and day, right through Sunday. You will build them by the thousands. And they did. And those things played a very significant role in defeating the German submarine attacks in the Atlantic on the people crossing the Atlantic with help from the British and later for the U.S. forces over there. And finally, with the radars plus new aircraft plus little aircraft carrier to launch the aircraft, and also as a result of the British breaking the German cryptographic systems, these oceans were swept clean of the Russian, not the Russian, but the German submarines by about 3 years after the beginning of the war. They had all been found and destroyed. So there's an incredible impact on the war that this place had, and in some sense equivalent to that of the nuclear weapon. It was at the time viewed as a balanced thing. They were both equally significant.
And then what happened at the end of World War II?
At the end of World War II, the government said, well, we built them all, and industry can carry on, so they folded it. And the only thing they did is in the final year of 46, they had a year spent to create a series of books that listed all the technology. There are about 20 books in this thing called the Radiation Laboratory Series. There's not much looked at today because they're pretty old, but in the beginning of the Lincoln Laboratory, which occurred several years later, and I'll go into that in a minute, these were the textbooks that you looked, no one else had anything like this. They were unique in the world, and foreign countries desperately, scooped them up to look at them, and many places in this country use them. And just about everybody in the electrical engineering department would have a set of them on their shelves to look at, to see what was described there. Now, the question is that you're asking is, where did Lincoln Laboratory come from? The Lincoln Laboratory came from the Radiation Laboratory rather directly. There were a number of professors who were at the Radiation Laboratory, still at the Institute. Gerald Wiesner was one, and Radford, Bill Radford was another. These are the two people in my undergraduate years that were closest to me and gave me special tasks to do, not theses, but things they wanted done. And they called on me to do these technical things of one sort or another. When the Cold War started, there was a big concern about Russian bombers. And it turned out that this was because of bad intelligence, this was an assumption that was incorrect. The Russians were not building large numbers of bombers, they were building ballistic missiles, as we learned later. But at any rate, it was decided that we needed to have a very good air defense system for this country. And the people who had been involved with the radiation laboratory were on advisory committees in Washington in the Defense Department. And the capabilities of these people were widely known in Washington, and the decision was made in Washington that basically the radiation laboratory would be recreated. And it was put together here in the buildings. Actually, we're practically sitting on one of the buildings. It's been torn down and rebuilt since then. Building 20, left over from the war days, was made part of it. And there were several other buildings here that were put together to make a start on this new thing, which at the beginning did not have the name Lincoln Laboratory. The reason Lincoln Laboratory is Lincoln Laboratory in name is that these buildings occupied space that the Institute needed for expansion. The expansion was occurring because the Institute was viewed as the leading place in the world in electronics. And there were all kinds of expansions in the courses in Department 6, which was the electrical engineering department, and in other areas in chemistry and whatnot. And they needed the space that was left over from the radiation laboratory. So Lincoln, whatever it was called then, and I don't remember the name at the beginning, was told, get out of town, and the place that was decided was Hanscom Airfield, which is a state-owned airport, but in World War II it was a fighter aircraft base to attack the bombers. So the decision was made, let's move there. And in *53, roughly, they started construction in that area, the lab starting in around '51 or so. And I was here in the lab as it began, and I'm the last person in the current Lincoln population that was there at the beginning. Everyone else is gone. At any rate, a big building was built out in Hanscom, which had a lot of land. The government owned sort of half of the land for the fighter airplanes, and the commercial people had the airport itself. It's actually something that Massachusetts as a state owns. It's a state-owned airport still to this day. But on part of the base is a piece of land which was set aside then and still there for development of military electronics. And Lincoln is on that land, as well as a large, I guess it's Air Force, set of buildings and people who purchase electronic systems, some of which come from the laboratory. So it's a combination base. There's no actual fighter airplanes or anything like that. It's a laboratory plus a procurement organization. That's what you're looking at there today. The building, as it began, held everybody pretty well. Now, how is everybody? It's about 1,800 people, of which maybe 600 or 700 were professional staff people of one sort or another, and about an equal number of technicians and another equal number of people to keep the building running and provide the power and the telephones and everything that you need to keep a thing like that going. So it was a sort of a 3-to-1 split of the 1,800 people. The reason I mention this is that later in its life, 1,800 will be looked back on as a very small number. in terms of what happened. The transformation of myself from MIT as a graduate student into the lab really occurred because of Radford, Professor Radford. Radford was a professor who taught electronics, and Wiesner took up teaching about radars. So these two people I knew very well in those days as a student. And when I came out of graduate school, there was a question with my wife and I, where will we go? And there were demands from all over the country for anybody that graduated from MIT at that point. So we took a look at several locations. One of them was where the atomic bomb was built, although not that. It was the support company that made the thing a real device, not the laboratory, not Los Alamos, but the organization that still continues to this day that manages the whole business. That was one place. Another place was in western New York State, in Buffalo, where there was an aircraft company that was working on air-to-air intercept and ground-to-air intercept systems. And that was something that I had worked on here as a thesis, telemetry systems for that. The third place was MIT, the new laboratory. By the way, the new laboratory, when it moved to Hanscom, originally was going to be put on a piece of land that was entirely in the town of Lincoln. So the name of Lincoln was attached to it. But that's not where the laboratory is located. It turned out that the Air Force wanted that land because it was nice level land, and they wanted to build a laboratory up there for themselves, in the electronics area primarily. So they said, you take the land that's over there, and the land over there is on the side of a hill, not the greatest place to build something. But that's where Lincoln Lab got built, and it turns out that Lincoln Lab has a little bit of Lincoln under it. It has a little bit of Concord under it, and it has a little bit of Lexington under it. All four towns come together under that place. Still called Lincoln Lab, though.
And Bedford, too. Doesn't it have Bedford there?
What was that?
Some of it is Bedford, too?
No, there's no. Bedford's connected to the airport, but the land doesn't reach where we are. Yes, Bedford is there. No question about it on that airport. At any rate, it got its name incorrectly applied. I don't know what name would have been appropriate for three towns, but anyway. The building that was built built at speeds that I have never seen replicated anywhere around Boston since then. It was an event which took about a year roughly, and then inside of a year they built a huge laboratory of maybe 400,000 or 500,000 square feet, and built to the ideas of people from the Bell Laboratories, because one of the people that joined the Lincoln down here came from Bell Laboratories. It was in an administrative position. And he brought with him the notions of an accounting system for a research laboratory, for a personnel system, and I'll talk more about the personnel system in a little bit, and the structure, organizational structure. And so his direction was followed, and it amounted to having a director's office with a few people as maybe an assistant director or associate director, and 6 or 7 divisions, each of which had a division head, and then there were groups. So there's a structure there that comes from Bell Labs, because that's the way it was built at Bell Labs. The thing that's very significant, most significant, I think, that came from Bell Labs with that person was the personnel system. The personnel system from the beginning was different than on campus. It's a separate system to this day, and it follows the Bell system. This is a very controversial matter, and I've ended up in court at least once when I was director in a fight about that system. The system involves the following. Each year, the group leaders and the divisions rank the people in the division. The division will have, I don't know, maybe 600-700 people. No, not that many, 300 people, say, something like that. Some of the smaller divisions, 100. And these would be the staff only, not the technicians or any of the support. And the promotions and the wage increases were directly connected to the positions of the people on the ladder. And as a matter of fact, the people at the bottom of the ladder were urged to leave, the bottom 2 or 3%, by one process or another. And that process, with a lot of change, goes down to these days that we have now. Now, many things happened over the years to tune up this system. It probably went through 4 or 5 or 6 variations, but the basics are still there to this day. Now, this is a very significant thing to the laboratory, because what it means is that you are maintaining the quality of the people. Each time you go out to hire people, because some retire or they move to a business or to industry or something like that, you replace them. And when you do hire them, you and they sometimes make mistakes. It isn't a large percentage, maybe 2-3%, maybe 4%, something like that. You make a mistake and they make a mistake for coming to the lab. And they just aren't able to contribute. It's not their world. It's something they're not up to for some reason or other. They may teach very well in a university, but they can't quite take the research game with intensity that it has, or did have, still has. So there's an examination every year for each of the divisions of the whole list, and who's on the list, and who's going to be promoted off the top of the list, and who is going to be asked to leave off the bottom of the list. Now, the result of this is that you maintain the quality over decades, because you do not allow the accumulation of people that are not too well suited to the situation. And this turns out to be an enormous advantage for the laboratory, and for MIT for that matter. Because the government laboratories in the Defense Department are under the civil service system. Civil service system does not allow anybody to be fired. It's sort of like the teachers' union and you fill in the blank, the firemen's union and so forth. You don't, unless they commit a heinous crime or something like that. The result of that, and I've done analytic studies on this over the years, trying to help the government with its laboratories, is that you accumulate, after several decades, a population which is not very noteworthy, shall we say. And the government is upset about this, of course, but the control of the civil service system is not within the control of the Defense Department or any of the other departments. It's a separate piece of Congress that manages it, and it's not very easily changed, although small changes have occurred recently, mostly due to my pushing on the government to change, to allow good people to get more money and so forth. At any rate, that personnel system lives on today, and the quality of the people lives on today. So they turn out then to be, the laboratory turns out to be an attractive source for people that want technical problems solved in the government, mostly in the Defense Department, but also the FAA and the energy people and several others come to the lab to get help in solving some difficult problem.
I'm very interested in something you said a few moments ago about the research game, and as somebody who's been involved in research for a lifetime, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of people who are suited to the research game and what the research game is about?
Well, in looking at a research laboratory and the people in the research laboratory, there are several classes of people that do the job, do the work. There's a small group, and I would say it's less than 10% of the professional staff, who are creative. You present a new problem to them, and right on the spot they'll start spouting out solutions to the problem. And they are the source of solutions to problems that are brought to the laboratory, or even where we go out to try to help people outside that are in trouble. Then there's a large body who are very good at the design of advanced systems that no one else has ever built before, and these would be, the vast majority of the people there. There is always at the edge of this community people who can sustain a continuing program and a continuing thing that the lab does. The lab doesn't just develop technology. It's not widely known, but it also operates operational systems. I can't discuss what those are here, except I'll mention one, and that is that in the case of the FAA, we have provided many of the improvements in safety of air travel over the years, and play a fairly deep role in running experimental advances in these systems. What are these systems? Well, developed at Lincoln for the FAA. One example would be the collision avoidance system. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but we've had air-to-air collisions occurred, the worst being in San Diego, I don't know, 4 decades back, maybe, something like that. And there was a severe need of being able to provide pilots and aircraft information that they were about to run into another airplane. The airplanes are equipped with beacons, and we devised a way that you could use the beacons to run a little box that sits in the cockpit of every plane that flies today in this country, every commercial plane. And the little box looks at what's around, says, we see several planes. Those planes are not dangerous, and so don't worry. If it sees a plane that is likely to be too close to the thing, it shouts out at the pilot, dive or climb. And those things are running all the time in all the airplanes to this day. That's not the only thing that came out of our work for the FAA. There were other things that were done which involved weather prediction for preventing accidents from planes trying to land in the wrong kind of weather and so forth. And those involved large experiments in the field at airports far from here. Logan was never one of them, and they're all scattered through the country. So this lesser group, or end group, you might say, of the staff was heavily in this kind of operation of experimental systems in the field to learn, did they work or not work? What were the problems? How could we improve them? So you really have a three-class society. You have some geniuses, maybe 10%, whatever. People's opinion can vary on what the number is. Then a large class of people who are skilled at transforming new ideas into reality. And then a separate group, a smaller group, that take the stuff into the field and run it experimentally. And I might say for certain programs that I can't discuss here. We run them for the government all the time. And we literally run sensor systems that are unique and no one else has and can build, but they're very important. I'll just say mostly they involve looking at spacecraft, making sure they aren't going to run into each other and things like that. But they're all, I can't discuss the details of those here. So if we go back to the beginning, these discussions have been sort of generic on the laboratory. If we go back to myself, a few words on what I ran into as the thing opened would be interesting, I think. The fact that one of the professors from the radiation lab joined the lab, Radford in particular, led to an interest in the lab, together with Wiesner, in the communications area, which was somewhat off the main core direction of the lab in building new radars and new computer systems to use the data and to find enemy airplanes or to run the FAA planes, because basically, as I'll mention in a minute, all of the FAA system basically is based on what was developed at the lab for military purposes. At any rate, I was not in that core. I was with Radford, and Radford was a division head who was interested in communications, and he and I knew each other from undergraduate days at the lab and graduate school. He was a graduate advisor, in fact, for myself. So I arrived at the lab in all innocence at the age of 21 or 20 or something like that. And I got told that we want to have you build a radio, but it's a radio made out of transistors. No one knew what transistors were when this was being told to me, and I certainly didn't know. And he said, these transistors will come from Bell Laboratory, and they are experimental, and no place else on the earth can you find these things. But we want to have you build the smallest possible radio out of these devices. And what was the motivation? The motivation was that these very small things, if they could be built cheaply enough, could be distributed in countries that were not friendly, shall we say, to receive radio messages from the State Department operated overseas radio systems, of which still exist, one sort or another. And they had visions of distributing thousands of these things. So in the course of a year or so, using transistors that Radford and I got from Bell Labs by going to Bell Labs and getting them handed to us as if they were treasures. They were treasures. These first transistor radios were built. As far as I know, they're the first that were ever built in the world. There's one or two of them sitting in my desk still to this day. As soon as they became known, there became demands from Japanese electronics firms that came to see, U.S. electronics firms came to see, and then the whole transistor radio business burst into the open after the transistors got into production.
Like mid to late 50s?
Yeah, yeah. It didn't happen that first year or two that I was there. It took quite a while to get the transistors understood and get production rates that were reasonable and get properties of them that were better than the first ones. First ones are very, very difficult to make anything out of. They had a lot of defects in them and electronic defects that made it difficult to build these things. So that was my first year or year and a half on the job. And at the end of that, I was switched suddenly into another area in the communications division. And this was to develop long-range radio communications for the military, for the country for that matter. You see, up to that point, the only communications overseas basically was shortwave radio, which is very flaky. You might say it doesn't always work. Half the time, more or less, it doesn't work. The ionosphere does not go along with your intent to get across the Atlantic. We had large numbers of nuclear forces that were beyond the reach of control from this country, from the president, because the communications didn't exist. So there was started there, 2 years after I was there, a program to develop communications that could reach across oceans. The first steps in this came, I think, from Wiesner's interests, maybe Radford's as well, in something called scatter communications. Now, most reliable communication systems are line-of-sight systems, and they don't break up because there's direct connection between the transmitter and the receiver. When you go beyond 20 or 30 miles, you're beyond line of sight, and so then becomes the problem of how do you build a reliable thing that will go more than 20 or 30 miles? Well, somebody in the business of examining the ionosphere had discovered that there were fluctuations in the ionosphere that were independent of whether it was able to communicate radio signals or not strongly. Small fluctuations in the scattering of signals sent at them. And by using large radio transmitters and big antennas, you could communicate 1,000 miles reliably through this scatter. Similarly, with shorter wavelength systems, meter systems or a fraction of a meter systems, you could get tropospheric scatter. So a large program began, and I was dragged into the middle of this thing to build systems, experimental systems, to test it out, see how well it'll work. And we built systems that were based, at least in the beginning, down in Rhode Island. I think it's in Rhode Island, maybe it may be in Massachusetts. Anyway, there's a place that was given to MIT by a donation from a very wealthy person. It was a large seaside location with a big house and so forth. And the first links were put down there, and transmissions from there to Bell Labs at Homedale were started, maybe a 200-mile link, and successfully. So then the military people said 200 miles won't get us across the Atlantic. We want more. So in successive steps, one was built at 400 miles, one was built at 600 miles, and one was built at 800 miles to see if it could be done. And it could be done. So there was a surge of construction of these systems to try to get connections to the nuclear people that were based overseas, some of them in Greenland and some of them in Europe and various places. Now, at their best, they did not cross the Atlantic. That has to be understood. They could go 1,000 miles. Well, you can get to across the ocean if you're willing to suffer some cold weather. You go north into Canada, and in the upper parts of Canada, you can cross to Greenland because the distance is small. You can go across the top of Greenland. You can come out the other side and go to Iceland, and then you can get to Europe. And
sort of hopping?
Hopping, from one to the other. And so the system was built like that. It was also built for the so-called dual line, which we were involved with very heavily. This is a set of radars across the north of Alaska to see the Russian bombers coming. They never did come. The only thing that came were birds that set off the system. Clouds of birds were migrating all over the place, and they were tripping the radar signals. That system now is, I don't think, operational, but for decades it was operational. And all the communications on that were scatter communications to connect the various pieces of it together and to connect it back here. So there was a big period in there for 10 years, maybe less than 10 years, where I was directly dragged into this business and sort of the leading person. And it turned out I also became of interest to international science groups that specialized in radio propagation. And so I found myself giving lectures in Russia, believe it or not, and in France and Japan. These are yearly meetings of this group, and they wanted to hear all about the scatter communications because it was a fabulous new thing that had not been in existence before. And these people interested in radio transmission of various types, and this was the international group that had meetings on the subject. So my wife and I have traveled to a lot of places during those few years. Well, all this proceeded along satisfactorily until Sputnik. Now, before Sputnik had gone up, I had a small discussion lecture group in one of the groups I had control of at that time. This was based on science fiction books that I had read assiduously earlier. And in those books you will find satellite communications described by one of the people. I've forgotten his name now, but he was one of the writers, and he spelled out the whole, how you would do it, basically. And at that point in time, and this is before Sputnik, I was thinking about, could you do this thing? But there were no abilities to get things into the sky, excepting when Sputnik occurred. Suddenly it was a changed situation, and the thing that we started to work on was an artificial ionosphere, which became notorious before it was finally finished and so forth. This was to put into orbit a band of very tiny metallic reflectors, little things about this big, very thin, and to use scatter communications off of this artificial environment. There were violent attacks on this whole idea on the part of the astronomers. And so part of my involvement with that overseas group, or that international group, was explaining how we were going to get all these things back on the ground. They weren't going to stay there forever. And it was a pretty hot political situation, nationally, internationally, and so forth.
This is the Westford program?
This is the Westford program. And it came to pass that it did go up, it did work, but we had put it in an orbit that would get it all back down on the ground again. The view changed pretty quickly that building satellites would be a better scheme because you could get more capacity and you wouldn't have this problem of the potential of these things running into things. Although they're pretty safe, they're so tiny they would hardly do anything to a satellite if they hit it. But everybody thought it was, would be deadly. So I got into a lot of meetings, international meetings and whatnot, explaining all this, and it was a fairly stressful thing. At this time, the Department of Defense decided they wanted to build communication satellites because Bell Labs was showing that they could probably be built. And I think they put up one or so, the first one in a low orbit. And they the department asked the Signal Corps, part of the Army, to develop a program to build a satellite. And this was to go on a launch vehicle that was in existence. The Army proceeded to get a contractor on the West Coast to build this thing, and the weight on the vehicle went past the weight that the launch vehicle could lift. And it was a terrible controversy. The general running the thing demanded that the weight be less, and the weight wouldn't be less, and the whole thing got hung up and nothing was happening, and the department was pretty furious about it. The people involved in the department at that time were what's now known as DDR&E. It's a Defense Development Research Organization. In those days, it ran the show, and the people that ran it, there were two people, an Italian, I can't remember his first name. Let's see, not even sure I remember his last name now. It began with F, something like Fino or some name of that sort. They were he was the person in the DDR&E that was furious with the Air Force, with the Army not delivering. And so a decision was reached in secret to tell the Army, stop, we don't want you to do anything more. And we will have Lincoln Laboratory develop the military satellites, which we proceeded to do. And we built a number of them, and they were launched, and then systems were built by contractors afterwards. And let's see, the name was Fanini, I think, or something close to Fanini. And the beginning of this whole affair connected with a problem at the laboratory. And the problem at the laboratory was that the air defense system, the so-called SAGE system, which the majority of the lab was working on, got itself designed. The first really big computer in the world was built to be used in it. Vacuum tube computer, by the way. My transistors didn't get into it at the beginning. 60,000 vacuum tubes in this thing. And it was being tested around New England with radars, and it was successful and was moving forward, and it was going to go into production. And so the government turns to the lab and says, now we're going to have you get it into production. And the president of the institute decided, and perhaps others, that it would be not fitting for the laboratory, for the institute, to be in the business of procuring huge quantities of radars and computers and things like that. So a thing called the MITRE Corporation was formed, which you may know about, and they were given the job of doing that. And there was a fairly close relationship between us as we moved the technology into their hands. There then arose a question: what will Lincoln Laboratory do now that the major program has been handed off to MITRE? And there was a great concern inside the laboratory. I was still, at that point, only a group leader. It's about 30 people or so, who had been working on the earlier communication systems that I talked about. The proposal was made to Gene Fubini, that's the fellow's name, that the Institute could move on to some other problems that were of concern to the government, to the DDR&E. Not the Russian bombers coming over the North Pole, because they're not going to come over the North Pole, but there were new problems. And two were selected, one because I had been in the communications business and it was a going-on thing, and that was to take over the development of the military satellite communications business. And the second was to play a leading role in defense against ballistic missiles, which had clearly shown up on the horizon by that time in Russia. And So the funding of the laboratory through those early years of the SAGE, which was around 20 million a year, was continued. But it turned out that Fubini wanted to feel the goods a little bit about what he was buying for his 20 million a year. I think I said billion, that's not billion, it's million. And so he wanted to meet me because I was clearly a key person for one of those two areas. So I was told to go to the West Coast and meet with him and talk with him for 20 minutes and cross back across the country again, all in a short time. That's the only time I've ever gone across the country for a 20-minute discussion with Fubini. And he liked what he saw, and he said, okay, you lead it. And a similar thing occurred with the ballistic missile defense area. So at that point, which would be 61, 62, somewhere in that area, the laboratory suddenly had blessings to go in two new directions. And the funding would continue, and in addition, more money would be coming into it from other interested parties in the government. We, in the very early years, stuck pretty much to this business, excepting it had fallout, which got us into other areas as well. One of the things that we built were fairly large radars to be used in the ballistic missile testing and see if you could find things that are in the sky and so forth. These are very big antennas. There's 50 feet across, 60 feet across. There's a 120-foot one up in northern Massachusetts, still in existence, that was built and is still being used. Now, there weren't ballistic missiles to look at particularly, hopefully, but these things did exist, and they were tried out on satellites. Satellites were going overhead, and as you remember, the first Russian launches were detected here by a radar that we had up at Millstone Hill. So a new phase, a new direction of the lab appeared on the scene, namely find satellites, find out how many there are, who's launching them, where are they, and so forth. And that remains a very strong component of the laboratory to this very day, and we run a number of operational systems, not just experimental systems, but actually checking what's going on upstairs. And there's one curious little thing that we do for a group of commercial companies that have satellites up there, communication satellites. There's a patch of the orbit, the synchronous orbit, where there are several of these satellites all living together, separated. And one of the satellites went berserk and lost its control systems and started drifting, doing whatever the gravity gradient caused it to do at that point. The people with the satellites got scared because what happens if it runs into our satellite? We spent, $200 million to build this thing and get it into orbit. So they came to us and said, with industrial money, and by then the Congress had allowed the lab to take industrial money for transfer of technology, would you please keep track of all the satellites and tell us who to move where and when to avoid this thing when it comes back and forth through our investments, which are $1 billion easily at that point. And so we've been doing that for a number of years. And we're still the people who keep track up there for those people. We also keep track on a lot of other things that go on in various orbits for intelligence people and whatnot to see who's doing what and where. And we're a central factor in the design of a new system to do this even better. So this is a branch sort of thing that I'm talking about. Another branch occurred because of the SAGE system, and it's with the FAA. The FAA had a terrible air control system in those years gone by. It didn't have radars that could follow the airplanes. It didn't have computers that could present the data to controllers. It just didn't have anything. So they came to us and said, we want to build an air control control system. It's like the one that you designed for the Russian bombers. And so that technology was literally picked up by its root, so dropped into the FAA, and that, to this day, is the air traffic control system. It's an old, tired system at this point, needs replacement with a satellite-based sensing system. But to this day, we're very tightly connected to the FAA as a fallout from that effort with Russian bombers. And that fallout business you can see it through several different areas at the laboratory.
Why don't we start by talking about the nature of the relationship between Lincoln Laboratory and MIT?
Fine. There has been a relationship from the very beginning. There was a period in time, however, where this became a controversial matter. And it happened not because of the laboratory and what it was doing, but because of what is now known as Draper, but was then known as the Instrument Laboratory. The Instrument Laboratory was the place in the world that developed the high-precision navigation devices involving gyros, 3 gyros. If you use them right, you can find out where you are in the airplane in particular. But you can also use them to guide a ballistic missile with nuclear warheads. And they designed a system and built prototypes and so forth. This became known on the campus and was considered unworthy of something connected to MIT. So they began a great crusade, maybe not so many people, but they certainly were vocal, to separate the Draper Lab, that's the latter late name, the early name was the Instrument Lab, and Lincoln from MIT. And there was a very intense few years that went on where the laboratory took the position that we were development place of technology, but we were not actually building anything that goes into nuclear weapons and so forth, and that it was all radars and communications, which it was pretty much. Nevertheless, a distinction was difficult to be seen in the eyes of the protesters, and the protesters arrived at the gates of the laboratory on at least one occasion, and they certainly arrived at the gates of the instrument lab down here in a much larger group. There was a lot of high-level discussion about this. I was not director in this period of time, but one of the assistant directors, Gerald Deneen, was asked to run a committee for a year or so to examine this and make some conclusion about the laboratory and maybe about the other place, Instrument Lab. I don't know which. I was given the nasty little task of sitting into a meeting each week where programs that were being proposed for the lab and the instrument lab would be discussed with a group which included some of the protesters. There were students in this, maybe 10 people or something like that. So for a whole year I'm there, and I am basically defending these programs that come into the lab. There come little ones and big ones, and you know, there's not just one program, it's a whole slew of things. And each time I'm explaining how this thing is going to be a good thing to have for the military, and it isn't going to be flying with nuclear weapons, which they weren't. They were mostly ballistic missile defense and communications, well, and a few other things as well. At the end of the year, a settlement was reached which disconnected the instrument lab from the Institute and kept Lincoln Laboratory connected to the Institute. But there was a a desire coming out of it that the people in the leadership here at MIT would keep a closer watch on Lincoln. This led to the notion that there should be reporting to the provost pretty periodically. And in my experience as a director, it was 1 month intervals on what was going on. And in addition, that we should have a committee to review the lab from the outside, and including faculty members, to come once a year and see the program listed in front of them for a day or two or something like that. Those two things were undertaken, and they continue to this day without a whole lot of change.
What is that like as a former director, and when you were director? How does that impact the laboratory?
I would say not at all. When I was reporting to, I'm trying to remember which provost now. Well, I can't remember right now which one it was, but there was a desire on his part to have a completely external review committee look at the technical work of the laboratory once or twice a year. And that formed up as a, and there were people from, the provost would be part of this, or yeah, the provost would be part of this review twice a year, whenever it is. And there would be a pretty deep discussion of all the activities that were going on in that meeting, presentations of various kinds of things, of programs and so forth. And that continues to this day. Provost still comes out and it's part of the normal life of the place. Now, as a director, I was the inheritor, apparently, of the beginning of all that. It started while I was made director. So, in some sense, I set a pattern for what has continued on with the other directors now. They're still doing that kind of a process of outsiders. And there was an intense pressure to get more connections with the faculty on campus, with the graduate students, joint programs of one sort or another, and that continues to this day. It's not vast, but it's there. And so there's money that flows from us, and money flows from the campus to do things at the laboratory. This has been especially significant in a recent time. Well, recent means back to 9/11 or so. There was a severe concern out of 9/11 about bacteriological attacks. And in the solid state division, there were one or two people who were very much into building lasers and things of that sort. And they had a broader education than just lasers and that sort of thing. They had a connection with some of the biologists down here. And they came to the biologists down here and asked if we had a laser, could we excite Raman radiation out of the bacteriological material that would signify it was bacteriological material, maybe identify it. And the answer was yes, it could happen. And so we built a sort of a prototype and went out, and it was tested with some other equipment at a range out in the west where they test sensors that see how well they can detect these things. Now, they're not the real thing. They're fake ones. That is, they don't use dangerous biological material, but it's a very similar kind of thing that's used. And this thing that these two people had put together beat everything on sight. It could find the bacteriological material inside of about 100 seconds. Air flowing through it, nail it within 100 seconds. Nothing else it was hours with other things. This instantly transformed our situation in that the government descended on us and said, we want those, and we want them very, very fast. Now these didn't identify the particular type. We did develop later something that could be attached, which would tell you also within 2 minutes what kind of biology this is. The person that led the way as to the biology of this was on the campus. So there was a close relationship between the two, still is for that matter. And these early devices were of such demand in Washington that we were told, you'll build 30 of them just as fast as you can. And they were moved around the White House and Congress and the Pentagon and so forth. And then you will also build a production version, maybe patterned on what you built or something maybe better, and find somebody that can build 1,000 of them. And we want 1,000 of them within a few months. And this was done. We knew that none of the defense industries could do it because they're too slow. And so we found a company in Florida that could do it, and they did do it. So they're scattered all over, God knows where, those things today, and probably more of them.
There are, from Lincoln, there's something like 95 companies that have spun off from work that started at the laboratory. I wonder if you could just mention a couple of them.
Well, I'll mention one, which was, there were some people at the laboratory who were involved with our long ago thrust into power sources, electrical power sources, which were not using any fuel. They were deriving from the sun electrical power, solar cell systems. This was the very beginning of the solar cell business, and it was in the, I've forgotten, it was in the years where this price of gas got very high and gas went short, and I think this was
late 70s.
Late 70, yeah, like 78 or so. So we had somebody in the solid state division who has been developing solar cells more or less out of the line money. He was free to go in various directions, and he had a new direction that he thought could improve the efficiency from 10% to 30%, which is a very big idea. So we sought money for this from the organizations in the government that were entering into the whole business of building solar cells and whatever else you could build that didn't use oil. The entities that we then had to deal with wanted more than him developing a 30% efficient thing. They wanted some power plants, solar cell power plants. So we got drawn into the building of the first big solar power plants in the country. Now, they weren't that big. They were in the, I don't know, 100 kilowatt class, say. And they were put in places that had no power, but they had a big demand, national parks installations and things of that sort. And I can remember going and looking at one of these things. And I remember publishing an article in the Tech Review on the future of solar energy and where the whole business might go. The predictions were not realized. They predicted there'd be a big turnover by the year 2000. There would be all kinds of hydrogen being made, and new fuels and things of that sort. It hasn't happened. Now to get to the business of the people leaving the laboratory, to get the DC power into AC to do something with it, you have to build a converter. And the converter has to like the solar cells, and the solar cells have to like the converter. So there were two people here that built a device like that, and it was clearly, they thought, a winner, and to be a big business in the solar cell business. So they formed a company. I think it was down in Connecticut someplace. And the bottom fell out, as you are well aware. A few years later, the price of oil dropped, its scarcity went away, and everything in this whole business died. And this company was going to die until they decided that the very same equipment could be used for computers to protect them from lineage, power lineage drops. If you're probably familiar, there are sudden drops in the power that you get from power companies. You don't usually see it, it's just a flicker in the light. Not so to a computer. It's death to a computer. It completely blows it when it happens. So the market grew enormously for this company, and it's still in business, selling little boxes that will keep the computer happy. Now, most people now have shifted into small computers, and they have batteries in them, so that the market for this has dropped off significantly. The big computers that sit on desks still need it, though, a protection against. So there was a business that started, failed in its original direction, but made a huge amount of money. There were 3 people in it. One person left, came back to the laboratory because he got sick of just building things, to do some work there. He was independently wealthy, very, very wealthy, and then left the lab to devote himself to fancy racing cars from Europe, which he sells at a place in New Hampshire. So that's a story, a local story of something that happened here. Another story that is more widespread is the laser diode. For that matter, the diode as an emitter was being worked at the laboratory and at Bell Labs and several other places. And pretty much simultaneously in 3 locations, people figured out how to make it laze. It's likely that the work at Lincoln was what led to it. They did all the preliminary work, and it was a final agreement there was be a 3-way split if there were any patents on this. Well, that device covers the earth at this point. Every time you put a disc in your audio system or in your TV system or make a recording here, there's a laser diode doing the job. So it's a worldwide transformation, that thing that was done in Division 8.
For somebody like you who's been directly involved in creating so many new systems, what is it about administration that appeals to you?
I think you have to view me as a victim of the process of administration, not a seeker. To go back to the beginning, I was a staff member, and for the first 3, 4, or 5 years, something like that, and we got to a point where the person leading the group was going to depart or something. I've forgotten the details of it now. They wanted to start a company, I think, or something having to do with the SAGE system or whatever. So I was asked to run the group. I didn't ask to run the group. I was suddenly told to run the group. And the first thing I was told to do was to make a chart of who's the best and who's the poorest. Times were tough, and we had to fire 4 people off the bottom. That was the first task that I was given. And it went that way pretty much all the way. I'm busy doing whatever I'm doing, and I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing. And suddenly I'm pushed into a higher position. They're not positions that I ever sought.
Did you find that as director of the laboratory you were able to do things that you couldn't have done any other way?
Yes, in the following sense, that we grew in size from the 1800 due to more things from the government and from the Department of Defense mainly, and FAA and all these places. So the number of the population began growing. And it grew to the point where we had to put people in buildings that weren't at the main building, on several buildings actually. And this is demolishes the interaction between people when you do a thing like that. So there became a desire for a building big enough to hold them all. And so I had a new person come in for the position that handles the administration of the money and the building maintenance and things like that. And he turned out to be a former Navy captain. It was a shot in the dark, and it was both good and bad. He got along with people very badly, but those were the people in the lab. He got along with the people in the Pentagon because he was a captain, and on the Hill because he was a captain, very, very well. And he alone is responsible for the big lab that was built there. I don't know whether you've ever seen it, but it's a doubling of the size of the lab. That one person did it.
Who was that person?
John, can't remember his last name now. He was very good at that, but then there was nothing for him to do after that, so we had to leave the laboratory because we had no more buildings to build. By the way, we've expanded enough now, so we're in a desperate situation again, very similar. We're having to take a division and put it outside. And there's talk of building a new building connecting to the old building. See, the essence here is to have the building one entity, like MIT is. All the corridors connect together so that you can go anywhere in the building without going outside. And it's a sprawling, complex place, but it holds the people together. If you separate, and instantly you've got a problem about people working together. And it's a very bad thing. So the current director will have to solve that problem. I'm not going to get involved the second time. It was a pretty difficult thing, and this fellow, McCook his name was, brought it off by himself, pretty much without any help from myself. And he had the contacts inside the Pentagon, he had the contacts on the Hill, and he managed it, which was a very, very difficult thing. And he also managed the choosing an architect and getting the design of the building. And I had a role, others in the steering committee had into the design area. But it was a big, big effort. Cost a lot of money. We're still paying for it. We only got 5 years to go.
I would imagine that one of the things that happened when you became director of the laboratory is that gave you access in Washington, D.C., and some significant influence. You served on a lot of committees.
Well, before that ever happened, I was on a lot of committees. And in fact, my secretary, for other purposes, recently put a list of all the committees together for some other purpose. And I was overwhelmed by what I saw. I had no idea that, because it's now 50 years or more, but incredible number of committees starting very early. When I was a group leader, I was on committees. And when I was a division head, I was on committees. And when I was director, I was on, associate director, yes, I was on committees, and still more committees as when I was director. Now I've managed to cut back down. We've managed to get the current director onto the Defense Science Board, which was one that I was on for many years, and one of the faculty was on as well. John, what's his name? The one in chemistry that had all the problems at CIA.
Yes, Deutsch.
Deutsch, exactly, yeah.
Yes.
Any rate, he and I were on some of these committees, and we've tapered down now to get the new director onto the Defense Science Board, which went through a problem with the White House and couldn't get him on till recently. And on another committee that I'm finally working with, which is the Chief of Naval Operations has a very private committee of about 30 people that are very broad in spectrum of capabilities. There are 2 women, for instance, that used to be in the House of Representatives as representatives, not as staff, but the real thing. And there are people who are in the State Department, experts on this country or that country. There's one fellow there that is the second guy on a ship that has 1,000 ships, shipping company, and he's of interest to the Chief of Naval Operations because here is a big operation buying ships, and the Navy could learn a lot from that. So that one committee is the one thing I'm left on at this point, and I, in fact, yesterday went down to the War College in Rhode Island on one of the meetings where I was chair with the leader of the study. There's a continuing study going down there, and I'm the sort of the daddy rabbit that got it started 15 years ago. So a huge number of committees all through the years, beginning when I was a group leader, and continuing all the way. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that at no time in all of this did I ever really think about the next step up. It just happened out of the blue to me. It just didn't, I was too busy doing other things, wasn't thinking at all. And the notion that when I started all this that I would be director is absolutely and totally foreign to any thought that I might have, because of all these people that are from the radiation lab who knew so much and I knew so little.
I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about MIT, and because you joined the faculty in '77, I believe. Can you talk a little bit about being on the faculty here and what that's like?
Well, it's not a very great connection. The laboratory is an extremely intensive thing, and that was when I became director. And that has you on the airplane to Washington, will you believe, 1,000 times at this point? 1,000 trips to Washington. Beginning in the beginning. It was happening in that first year when I started making that transistor device, and hasn't stopped to this day. So the connections here are pretty thin over the years. Now, maybe this is not as a good thing, but it's a parallel thing with recent directors of the laboratory, not an intensive connection here. Now, there was a intensive connection at the beginning because the founders, you might say, came from the radiation laboratory, but they came from the faculty, and they were still in the faculty as they moved into the lab. But they then retired or died or whatever. And so that kind of a connection disappeared. So it's a relatively thin connection, which maybe it shouldn't be, but it is, because the distance is what the distance is. I think if it were local, the whole thing were local, it would be very different. We would have many more graduate students present out there. We do have sizable numbers of graduate students at the college, at the lab. And the supervisors of the theses are our staff. They're considered by the faculty here to be of enough of a stature, so they're.
Because you've spent so much of your time at the laboratory, do you think of yourself as an MIT lifer?
Well, yes, in the sense that I've now retired, and there's this sort of a continuum that I've been here since I was 16 years old. That's a long time. But I don't get heavily involved in anything that the faculty is busy doing down here. I mean, I read the faculty reports. They have their own letter, as you probably know. And it's interesting. They're concerns of one sort or another, but the concerns we have and the concerns they have are quite different. We have the potential of helping them in many areas and providing positions for research for their people getting degrees, experiments of one sort or another. And there's usually 2 or 3 people put on to help the student get his degree, but we're the one who usually supervises the experimental work at the lab that he does. The other 2 review the work that he's doing, but they're not as strong in connection. So there are connections of the previous director that came after me down here working with various groups. And there are connections in the biology area, no question about that, because it turns out that original work on the biology led to all kinds of new instruments and new ideas at the laboratory, which involve people down here in the biology department. And we have our own collection of biologists now. I don't know how many there are, but there are dozens of them. And a big chunk of a division is just working in the biology area. It's almost completely in the area of, it's a broad area in some sense. Most of it's focused on detection of bacteriological materials. There is at least one person in there who is very creative and has a notion that is incredible, and whether he'll bring it off or not, I don't know. If he does, it's an instant acclamation in the world. He believes he knows how to manipulate cells in the human so that they will reject any disease, any virus disease, any biological disease. And he has done a lot of experimental work on this, including with mice, the mice being down here, I believe. And so there are these people who are into new areas that are really not connected in a sense with the old laboratory, you might say, but they're entirely new things that are being poked at with these biological people, one sort or another. And always with a fairly big connection with the biology department here. By the way, I might say that the biology department has a very strong effort in brain science, and it has a building associated with that, as you're probably aware. It's right sort of that way. That building and the one across the street that has the brain scientists or the artificial intelligence people there, I believe is a result of my beating on a previous provost and saying the Institute has to get into this business. And that happened because of that. I believe that's why it happened. And it happened. It took some pressure to bring those groups together, by the way. You probably know, or maybe you don't know, to get them together. Now, my final notion was we build a bridge across the street out here so the two connect together because they're related. This turns out to be an area that I'm somewhat interested in. Not brain science in the biological area, but in the structure of the brain and how it does its operations. And this is sort of a thing I do on my own at home, not in a lab, but not here either. Looking at the mathematics of what you want to do for recognition, forgetting the brain, and then looking at what is the brain doing, and it turns out the brain always got there firstest. A good idea you think about for the electronics, and then you look carefully at what's happening in the brain, and it's done it before. For instance, just to give you an example, there are lots of neurons in the brain. It turns out that the neuron is busy converting everything into logarithm calibrations. It isn't just passing on things directly. It takes the logarithm of what was put to it and passes it on. It then turns out that processes are undertaken in the brain which amount to combining things together, not by adding them together, which is all the work that's been done on artificial brains in the past, just simple addition of inputs. It's done by taking a higher order root of the signal that came out of the brain cell, and then that's done in the format of the thing that was constructed by the Viron by doing actually a modulation of the intensity of the signal. That turns out to be rooting it, taking the root of the number that originally went into the thing. Then it adds it when it goes into the next Viron. That's equivalent to doing a multiplication. So the basic processing that's going on in the brain is taking the root and then taking and multiplying the signals that are going in all these various directions. That's completely different than anything that's understood today. A few brain scientists have stumbled on the fact that there is a logarithm operation going on. And they've been looking at it and saying, gee, this looks exactly like a logarithm's being taken. Well, that's exactly what you want to do when you want to build a very good system that will do recognitions. I'm not interested in anything beyond recognitions, nothing about creative art, music, or anything. The brain is very good in those areas, but I'm just interested in that one area. And why am I interested in that area? Because there are a lot of problems today, as you know, with irregular warfare and terrorists and so forth. And those are problems of finding one entity in a huge bundle of others who are innocent. And so it's a recognition problem of a very difficult nature. So that's something I play around with a bit to keep in the science area. It's something you have to do even as you were director, just to keep some hold on something in the technical sense.
From your various associations with MIT over the years, what is it that you think makes MIT's culture or environment unique?
Well, I think that MIT goes back a long way in history, as you know. It goes back to just after the Civil War. And at that point, the institutions that existed in this country, the higher institutions existed in the country, were primarily liberal arts organizations, and they had their roots as teachers of priests and directors of various kinds of churches, one sort or another, rectors and whatnot. That Civil War showed the face of an enormous industrial system starting in this country, and in England too, for that matter. Railways, were a big thing in it, and telegraph, and all kinds of things. So somebody, and I don't know who they were, said, we need to have a higher educational institution which deals with that world, not with the liberal arts world. And that was the basis that it started out on. Now, it was not very unique for a long, long, long time. There were other schools that started, one in Worcester, for instance, and there's one down in New York State someplace, and somewhere else there's one of these things. So you ask the question, why did MIT change? What caused a change? All these places were pretty tough on the students. That is, these were not easy places to go to. They had, high-level mathematics involved and all the rest of it. So I don't think MIT was particularly unique in that sense. But the transition probably came after they moved across the river, and probably with the beginning of the Great Depression is where I think that the transformation began, because at that point times were very difficult, and the Institute, I believe, felt it had to produce students who were able to get a job, I guess is a simple way to put it. They were so good that they could do that. And that started to build up through the Depression, is my view. And then the idea of going out and doing original science and so forth also was part of this, and it's not evident in some of these other places like Worcester Polytech. More so today, but it wasn't characteristic in those days. So there were ventures out into the unknown. For instance, the reason the Rod Lab came here is that people were exploring waveguides for use in aircraft landings or something like that in the Depression. And they were the world's experts on waveguides. Well, waveguides were needed for microwave radar, so where did the people go? With the British, with their little magnetron, they went to MIT. So they built during the Depression, is my view of it. Then,
so the first, say, during its first 50 years, your sense is that MIT was not
unique.
Was not unique and was not known as sort of the technological center.
No. I mean, it was in a class of, they were all at that business, so it wasn't one of the best of all. It wasn't that at all in that period. In fact, they had terrible quarters across the river in the city. Other places had much better quarters than the beginning. Then the thing that did it, absolutely did it, is the radiation lab. When that occurred here, and the power of what was done with it, instantly changed the status of this place to the best in the world. It was in a class with the nuclear weapon business. It was that kind of a thing. And so everybody rushed to come here, and I experienced this when I came here. I was sort of an innocent 16-year-old, and things were pre-war, you might say. We had somebody clean the rooms for us and make the beds and whatnot. And the war ends, and a flood of students appeared on the scene who all want to go to MIT. And everything changes at MIT at that point. All the people have to do their own, keeping the sheets up and so forth, have to make their own beds. All of the rooms are doubled. It used to be 1 to a room, now it's 2 to a room. You could see this massive group of people coming in to MIT because they thought it was the place to get a degree. And they overwhelmed the place. It was just, we had a sized room, a sized class of maybe 600, 500, 600. It was instantly 1,000, that fast.
What about today? How do you see MIT in its place in the world?
It may be a prejudiced view. I think it is the best technical university in the world. There's nothing even close. Nothing. And you can tell by the attempts of overseas people to get invited here, shall we say. As you know, for the undergraduates, there's a limit. If we didn't have that limit here, it would be filled with foreigners. Because the education outside this country, in many countries, is better than it is here. The schools that I knew in Springfield 50, 60 years ago, there is not a single school in this country of that caliber. For instance, the English class that we had at the senior year, I guess, was taught by a Yale professor who couldn't get tenure. But he could get a job very few people could get any jobs at that point, of course, in the country. And the same went with all the rest of the faculty. These people were real experts in their fields. We don't find that in our schools today. Overseas, you find much better teachers. They're appreciated a great deal better. They're highly ranked. If you go back 100 years here, the school marm that was going to teach the one-room schoolhouse was the most advanced person in the village in education. The rector maybe could be a competitor to her, but she was his equal. That's not true today over the entire country. It's gone. And that is a disaster for this country, in my view. There are a few very good private schools that can produce people, and there are some fairly good schools, technical schools, that can get people into MIT. But there is nothing even close, not even close to that school that I went to in Springfield. That was entirely a different world. Those people were technical experts in their fields, real experts. I mean, they had run companies, for instance, some of them, that their companies had gone bankrupt. And in those days, you didn't have to go to a teaching school, by the way. They received, people that wanted to come, listen to them, talk to them, and hired them on the spot. There was no union, and the wage scale went with how well you worked. And if somebody didn't work out, they were out, gone. So we don't have anything like that today.
So how do you think MIT has managed to maintain its excellence?
How does it manage this, you wonder? Well, a starting point is attracting very good people, some of whom become professors. You have a basic regeneration process. If you have a company like General Motors, to cite a terrible example, there was not a regeneration process. The company processes and organization stayed fixed, and no matter how good the people coming in were, it didn't get any better. In fact, it got worse, and finally almost did go bankrupt. The very good students that came were, the very best of them were made professors, became professors, teaching assistants first, maybe then professors. So there was an intense screening of the people to get the very best. And I think between the attracting the very best and then educating them, you got a faculty that was extremely unique, not like what existed in the other technical universities. Now, well, there are exceptions, of course. There's Stanford to some extent, and then there's the one in Los Angeles.
Caltech?
Caltech, yeah. Caltech and Stanford are both places that, in some sense, emulate MIT. What's missing, though, is the huge research efforts that MIT has accumulated over the years, which attract very, very good people and produce results that are published and that other good people see, and they say, I want to go there. So it's a self-generating process of some sort. I don't think they ever set out with malice of forethought to do it. It just happened.
It does seem that a lot of the people who, were graduate students, then become faculty members, wind up staying here.
Yes, if they get to be a professor.
Yes.
Most don't. And those are, by the way, hired by the lesser technical places. Literally, that's where they go.
Is there something about working at MIT that keeps you wanting to stay here?
Well, I can't speak too well for the faculty on campus. I can only speak for the laboratory, and the laboratory people know very well what the rest of the world is like, because they deal with the rest of the world, the technical world, because they have to deal with industry and transforming some of their work, into production, and they have to deal with government laboratories, because some of the government laboratories are where the money comes from, and so forth. And they are very good calibrators of quality. And they know probably more about the quality of our technical institutions in this country than anybody else, because they see it and feel it. It's part of their work. And they can easily draw the conclusion that there's no place better than Lincoln Lab. And probably the same is true on campus, that there is a large contact here with other similar institutions around the country, wherever they may be. And they have a very significant calibration, you might say, and therefore they stay. Now, of course, the ones that don't make tenure leave. That's a filtering process of sort. It's much tougher than anything that we apply at the laboratory, because the number that successfully make it are not 100%. They're not 50%. They may be 20%, maybe even less. I don't know.
Do you think, or what role do you think the collaboration between departments here, does that play into the success of the institution?
It may very well. One of the things that this place has, which others do not have, is entities that are not parts of departments. They are collections of people from various departments that are interested in a single field. The brain science people, may very well come from more than just a biology department. The range of interests in a thing like that could really be beyond the walls of the classic departments. There's a good question of whether the departments are organized properly at this point or not. That keeps being examined. No big changes occur that I can see, and so maybe it's okay, but it may be that over the longer haul that some different structure is in order. I don't know what the structure might be, both in terms of the kinds of things that were being handled and the arrangements for interactions between departments. See, one of the things that is weak here, I think, not weak at the lab, is the interaction between groups. There is a strong pressure at the laboratory for research to get spread, not just among the people in one group, but many other groups. And many projects there, in fact, when the director gets reports by the group leaders, which I sit in on every Monday, well, almost every Monday, there's a question always has to be answered. What are your connections to other groups? And up goes a plot which shows all the connections. We're getting money from them to do this, and we're sending money there to do that, and so forth. That intensity of interaction, I don't think exists here among the departments. There is probably some of it, but it's not as intense as it is there. Most of those efforts, research efforts of one sort, have more of a project being done outside the group that owns the thing than inside the group that owns it. This group went out and got the money and sold it to somebody, and then they turn to other groups that have expertise that they want. They all turn to the mechanical engineering division, because almost anything you want to build has to be built. And those people build it. And they provide more than that. They provide, the mechanical engineering division provides program guidance. They will tell the group how you should organize your project to get it done in the fastest time and not overrun the money and so forth. So that, curiously enough, that's the place where the programs are laid out, the big programs, and and the reports on who's doing what and are they doing it on time and are we all locked together are done by that particular division. That kind of interaction I don't see here at this point, with the one exception of the biological people all being pushed together. There must be some interaction going on there, because kicking and screaming, they got put together in that one thing. And the artificial intelligence people the same way. There's been some compression to near neighbors. The near neighbor business doesn't have to be done at the lab, though. I mean, everybody knows where the experts are, and even though the place may be quite a long walk away, inside the lab. Now, it's important, it has to be inside a laboratory with a continuous corridor system that will take you anywhere. That's vital, absolutely vital. If you don't have that, you're going to have isolation. You can't do this cross-connection business, which is very, very intense at the lab and has been for a long time.
How about if you tell me a little bit about your dealings with Washington?
Not so pleasing problems. Well, there are two classes of problems. One of them, and the Institute faces this as well, I've discovered. One of them has to do with the business of discharging staff for poor performance or whatever. We have been quite successful in handling people that have to go, with a long-term process with them. Could extend out to 2 years. We may even find them a place to work. However, there are some individuals where this is not acceptable, I guess is the way to put it. And they sue the Institute or the lab, and you get involved in legal cases as the director, even though you weren't the person that actually fired the person. And the reason I bring this up as parallel here is that you have a large group of people who did not get tenure. And on one occasion, and I won't mention which provost this was, I came down to report to the provost as director once a month, just how are things going at the lab and all like that. And he had a long table. You may have seen this table in his room. And the table was completely covered with piles of paper. There must have been 25 piles at least. These were lawsuits by professors who didn't make it. So we have been relatively better off. And I think our processes are such that you can avoid most of the cases by helping the people get jobs and having a long transition period if it's going to happen. Now, if a person is totally useless, that things happen quicker, but they know they're useless and there isn't that problem. So this is an aspect, not a pleasant aspect, and I've been in courts of law several times, shall we say. We've won all the cases, but it requires a lot of time with lawyers and examination of our personnel system to see that there's no hole in it that can be used. So that's one aspect that is thrust upon directors. Another one has to do with the Congress of the United States. The Institute and some other organizations are organized as a class of entities which the government will deal with in a specialized process. I won't go into the details of it, except to say that there have been complaints by profit-making companies that some of these entities on the outside, not the lab, but some of them, particularly ones that did work of assistance nature, that is trying to help out some entity in the government. Those people were profit makers, complained about the DDR and E classes of, and there were about 10 of them, maybe less than 10 now. Most of them were small. There were two big ones. One is Lincoln and one is the Johns Hopkins FFRDC. Forgotten its exact name now, but at any rate, there are two big ones. There have been attacks at least 3 times on these classes of organizations by these profit-making groups, which have fallen on bad times when the country's fallen on bad times and the amount of money available out of the Department of Defense to fund them drops, and they start complaining about these organizations. Now, why are they complaining about them? Well, the fact is that these organizations are able to operate under contracts which are all-inclusive. That means that each piece of work, each little project or big project, does not have to involve the development of a separate contract. It involves sending money into an omnibus contract, which the Air Force prepares. So it's quite easy to send money into the laboratory. But you have to have the money to send, of course, from Washington, but you can send this money easily. Whereas the other companies, they have to have contracts, and they feel they're being abused, shall we say. There have been, as I said, 3 blow-ups of this sort. The first ones I know very little about because the directors I wasn't, in that position. But the second 2, I was heavily involved. And I don't want to go into all the details, but they tended to end up in a congressional hearing and having to defend the laboratory as an important national capability. And the whole process of that is not one of the great parts of being a director. You have to operate by developing support out of the military departments there, particularly the OSD, DDR and E. You have to get the fellow that runs that on your side in this business, and you have to get it done by, at least one case, by having him take the lead in setting up a hearing in which it's all explained, in which can get a positive statement on the out of it, namely that they will not disengage or undo all these places, make them be profit makers, or get rid of them because of the contrast in the way they operate against the public companies. Those public companies have profited enormously. They've grown to $1 billion-a-year things in some cases. So there's nothing to complain about particularly. Some of the little ones still are maybe complaining, and it may come back again. The last attack was about in the mid-90s, somewhere in the mid-90s. There was one, and then the previous one was way back. Maybe 20 years earlier than that. When times were tough, that would be in the 70s. In the period of, right in the middle of the 70s, there was an attack, and that one was solved without getting a hearing. We solved it by having the right person in the right place who did things for us. So that size of the activity, I haven't talked about. I mean, there are other worse problems even than that, I think, and that is that in any company or any organization or any university of any size, you're going to have some people that have some severe emotional problems. And you end up, as director, having to face some really nasty situations. And I won't go into the details of those, but it's not pleasant, and it's not a good thing for anybody. And the size of the organization is the important factor in this. If you're a little bitty organization, you probably won't have any of these people. If you're an organization that has a couple of thousand people, you're going to have some, but they're probably okay. If you're a university that has 20,000 students, you've got some killers on the campus, and they've gone out and killed, as you're probably well aware. And the failure of the large universities is that they haven't provided enough supervision of the students to spot them and save them before they do something horrible. In a smaller organization, you can spot them, and MIT is one where you do have people watching. There are the people that are helping out as tutors, but they have another job to watch for these people and help them and prevent them from doing something horrible. So that's another not too great thing that the director has to deal with. Not all the time. I mean, these are sieges that occur from time to time. It's a very demanding job in the sense that it is not an internal job all in one small package. It's a thing that involves people in Washington, hence 1,000 trips to Washington on my part, and people that are engaged with industrial organizations and things of that sort, because what we develop has to be built somewhere, so there's a transition, and you have to get involved with the transition of the technology to another entity. So unlike a professor here who can, if he wants to be pretty localized, in his world can be pretty finite, the director of the lab is not in that situation. He is in an exposed position, has lots and lots of things that has to worry about, many different directions. And for some odd reason, they kept me on for 20 years, actually 21 years. Now they're turning them over at 5-year intervals. They perhaps think it's too much for somebody to stay.